Hello. This lecture gives an introduction to the key theoretical perspectives of the unit and introduces the wider perspectives that we will be studying. The objectives of the following short lecture are to just look at key concepts. So these are abstract principles. I'm just going to speak very broadly about perspectives because a perspective is a holistic framework that comes from a particular way of thinking. A perspective is not just one thing, it's a collection of ideas that has usually got a central belief or principle. So I'm just going to go through some of those wider perspectives very generally. Secondly, we're going to briefly review physical and psychological development from birth to older ages and explain the principles associated with cognitive development and with social development. Now, in the Hoffnung text, social development is more often than not termed psychosocial development. So for the purposes of engaging with this course, you can consider social development to be the same as psychosocial development. It basically just means the development that we undergo by interacting with other people in the society and with the environment. What makes us do what we do when we do it? And what accounts for the fact that we make different decisions under different circumstances? Well, this is a huge question, and theorists throughout time have grappled with this sort of question. And if you had to divide it into two camps only, you have the camp that believes that all our behaviour is governed by nature, by biological processes, by genetics, by inherited characteristics, and that largely determines what we do. You have a contrasting camp, equally as important, of people that believe not so much that the biological or nature isn't important and doesn't guide a lot of our behaviour, but that the environment itself is much more influential in governing human behaviour than the nature itself. So the nature-nurture debate is presented in your textbooks. Have a little look at it. It's very interesting, and there is a perspective in the middle, and that is the perspective of social psychology, which takes the knowledge from the physical and also acknowledges the very influential and sometimes unseen influences of the socio-cultural world. Within these broad frameworks of tradition between nature and nurture, there are many different theoretical perspectives and many different people who write about different perspectives. So the classic example is the biological models of human behaviour, which explain development in terms of biological traits. So we have developmental milestones for infants or normal ranges for adults. And this is to a large degree predictable, as are some of the other physical characteristics of the lifespan. Puberty, for example, hormonal changes throughout the lifespan. The physical models of development are very useful as a basis for exploring human behaviour, but they are by no means definitive. In the specialty that I worked in, which was disability and rehabilitation, people were constantly falling outside the predictable norm, and for them there was what's referred to in the literature as a new norm. But for the broad population of people that fit within a broad range of what we consider to be normative, it's helpful for nurses to be able to work with the predicted transitions of life. But it's equally as important that we always consider both those that undergo unpredictable transitions and those that have lived with the consequence of an unpredictable transition from their early life. We now know that for children with various sorts of physical disabilities, hearing impairment among them, that they learn language at exactly the same rate as a hearing child. There is no difference, but it is seen now as a different cultural group. So the non-hearing community and Auslan as a language, that is a legitimate Australian language. Unfortunately, it's a language that not many of us can speak or use, but it is nevertheless a language. So we will be looking at the physical aspect of different stages of the lifespan in terms of predictability, and this will be very helpful to the midwives earlier in the course and helpful to all of the Bachelor of Nursing students, because you'll be working with people from the very beginning to the very end of their lifespan. Midwifery students may not be working with the older age groups in life specifically, but indirectly, because of a range of things these days, you will be working with older people, grandparents, great-grandparents, particularly these days, and you'll also be working with many unpredictable transitions. So you'll be dealing with grief, you'll be dealing with the diagnosis of disability, you'll be sort of supporting parents and their loved ones to raise their infant or their child within a normative framework, because it's also been demonstrated that age appropriateness is one of the key things to work with if you're working with an individual who hasn't quite reached that level of cognitive development. We no longer treat people who have reached a more concrete stage of concrete development as a child. We acknowledge that people are adults regardless of where they fall within the physical model of development or its variations.
As well as physical models of growth and development, there are also psychological models that focus on the human mind. The psychoanalytic or psychodynamic model of Sigmund Freud, who you may have heard about in previous studies, emphasised the role of the unconscious in influencing behaviour. It's still a popular approach in some psychological arenas, specifically the field of psychotherapy and hypnosis, but we won't be covering the psychological models specifically in this course. The psychological model of growth and development, though, which did focus specifically on the unconscious mind, influenced later psychosocial models which focused on the mind as well as the influence of others and the environment. And the work of Erikson, which we're going to look at in detail in this course, was actually informed by a psychoanalytic approach. Erikson was actually one of Freud's students, but Erikson extended the understanding of human development to incorporate more contemporary aspects of the society.
There is another school of thought that directly contrasted with Freud and the psychoanalytic school, and it developed more or less at the same time or slightly after Freud, but in direct response to some of his writings. And the behaviourist school or model is often called a learning model because we use many of the behaviourist principles, which are expressed in terms of classical and operant conditioning, during educational sessions or targeting educational focuses. So the behaviourist school believed that all behaviour was learnt and all behaviour therefore was shaped by the environment. They didn't believe in a unique unconscious which was responsible for human behaviour, and many of the principles of behaviourism are directly relevant to nursing practice. So we're going to look in depth at classical and operant conditioning and apply it to contemporary practice to give you a bit of a taste of that particular school. But it is I'm calling it three things: a school, a model, a perspective. As I said at the beginning, a perspective is a broad way of looking at things. So behaviourism is such a large collection of theorists that it is a perspective in its own right. There are also different models or ways of implementing behaviourism, and they're shaped by those principles of classical and operant conditioning. And behaviourism is sometimes called learning theory, so that's why I'm using three different words to describe it. But you could say it's a perspective. It is a school of thought, it is a school of personality, and it's a way of looking at human behaviour.
The main perspective that we're going to examine in this course is the social perspective, sometimes called a psychosocial perspective. And your textbook starts by examining some adult lifespan developmental perspectives to illustrate exactly what a lifespan approach is. The normative crisis models of development explain the view that developmental change occurs in a series of distinct periods or stages which are influenced by both the physical and the cognitive, meaning thinking, mental and decision-making performances of the individual. So the main perspective that we're going to be examining in this course is the psychosocial model of Erikson, which we will examine every week. But in your textbook, there is also some examples of lifespan development models that pertain to the adult stages, both young adulthood and later adulthood. So Valiant's phases of adult coping is very similar to some of the stages of Erikson's theory, and Valiant's theory focuses very much on the transitions of adulthood, whereas Erikson's model covers the entire lifespan. Levinson's model of adult male life phases we're not going to be going into in this course, but you might want to have a look at it in your textbook as an example of another developmental model. The social or psychosocial models of human development include models which look specifically at the society and culture, which are the sociocultural models, and how the society influences our thinking, which are the socio-cognitive models. And both of these draw our attention to how other people shape and develop us through social interaction. Erikson talked about social development in terms of stages through the lifespan where, again, on an unconscious level, individuals, according to their life stage, encounter certain conflicts, and these key conflicts are part of shaping our individual identities. According to Erikson, it is the successful resolution of these conflicts in a positive way rather than a negative way that's going to develop our progress throughout life and influence us to move on to the next life stage. Cooley is a theorist that we will look briefly at when we examine adolescent development. Cooley developed a theory called the looking glass self, where he suggested that our main interpretation of our own behaviour actually came from the society around us, which reflected their perspective of us, which we then internalised. Socio-cognitive development was developed by a theorist called Bandura. Bandura brought a new perspective to the social argument of Erikson, and he focused very much on modelling and imitation. So Bandura called his theory a social cognitive theory because he explained how our cognitive development in childhood was influenced by the social world. One of the things about Bandura, that was very famous was his Bobo doll experiment, which is in your textbooks, in which he demonstrated that children who were exposed to simulated violence by an adult then potentially went on to be aggressive, mimicking or modelling the aggression that they had been exposed to. So when you're doing your written work for this unit, if you are interested in parenting and the psychosocial development of children and how that influences their thinking, then you might want to look further at Bandura's work. Vygotsky was a theorist who focused very much on culture. So I won't go into Vygotsky's theory now because we're covering it a little later in the lecture series. But in brief, Vygotsky demonstrated that in terms of children's cognitive development, there is a particular zone of proximal growth where children will ask for assistance, and if the assistance is given when and where they need it, then they scaffold their learning and can then develop their cognition a little faster. So Vygotsky and the next theorist I'll talk about, Piaget, were slightly different in their approach to understanding thinking. At this point, I just want to remind you that you don't have to remember all of these theorists in the first week. I'm just giving you a general overview now so that you're familiar with some of the names of the theorists that we'll be using throughout the course. But as the course goes on, particularly in the revision quizzes each week, I'll draw your attention to the theorists that are the most important to remember for each life stage. Another perspective in lifespan development that we will examine in quite a lot of detail is the cognitive perspective of Piaget. Cognition refers to thinking, decision-making, and mental processes, and Piaget developed a four-stage theory which explains how children learn. So we'll be looking at that in great detail early in the course. And finally, we have a look at moral development and moral reasoning, according to Kohlberg. How children throughout childhood, adolescence, and finally adulthood develop their sense of understanding rightness and wrongness. Throughout this course, while we don't look at emotional development specifically, we do look at emotional development and coping in an embedded way throughout the course in our discussions of self-concept and self-identity. In summary, therefore, psychological models, behaviourist models, social or psychosocial models, cognitive models, and moral theories together allow some understanding of the human condition. In terms of the terminology that we use throughout the course, Hoffnung et al. On page 58 discusses normative and non-normative events. And throughout all of these theories that I have discussed in this lecture, normative events follow an age-appropriate social timetable. They are more predictable. Throughout the lifespan, people tend to engage in work, establish partnerships, nurture children, and towards middle age, the physical decline that is sometimes experienced is balanced by an increase in wisdom and learning. Non-normative events, in contrast, can occur at any point in a person's life, and they're unpredictable. For example, your textbook talks about being widowed in the early life stages or developing a serious illness before older age. The focus in this unit is on understanding the psychological, social, cognitive and moral components of human behaviour across the lifespan from infancy to older adulthood in order to understand and support people from many different walks of life. In order to do this, we often need to firstly examine the physical or biological perspective, and for some theorists, this informs our understanding of the other life domains. Over the years, the physical lifespan of an individual has changed and lengthened in most high-income countries, so some of these models of development are open to more critique today than they have been in the past. But theorists are constantly expanding and developing and broadening our understanding of human behaviour, and many of these theories are helpful to nurses and midwives in attempting to predict and understand the behaviour of those in their care. Many of these are also the basis of theoretical frameworks for research, which forms the evidence in any sort of health or social care. The main critique of developmental theories are that they fail to consider the diversity of human behaviour. So developmental theories are also called stage theories, which I'll go on to discuss briefly in the next lecture. But the critique of these stage theories is that if an individual doesn't fall within the normative stages, they're often labelled as abnormal or deviant or in some way bad, when in reality all of the lifespan theorists allow for the diversity of human behaviour. In this course, we will be looking at life transitions between each and within each stage of human development. So for an infant, being born is the first major life transition they experience. And for the new parent, the new mother, that itself is of course a major life transition. And that's what we'll be starting the course with in the following modules. For some people and for some children, life is a process of overcoming challenges, learning new skills, adjusting to impairments or chronic illnesses or disabilities, or those things that we could say are more or less unpredictable or non-normative life transitions. They don't happen to everybody, but for some people they're a part of their life and embedded into their life experience. That's the conclusion of this first lecture in Human Relationships and Life Transitions. I hope I've been able to demystify some of the broad theoretical perspectives and principles in the course. And as we go through the modules now, we're going to be looking more specifically at each of these theorists and some others, and we'll be able to clarify all of these terms for you in tutorial discussions. Thank you.